I think it's important to note that not only are these not the only things that the Trump administration has recently rolled back in terms of export restrictions, but all of the things that they've rolled back so far are things that they themselves imposed this spring, either in April or in May. So when Treasury Secretary Bessent indicates that these were, chips that were part of the London negotiations, I take that at face value. They imposed more restrictions on exports of certain goods that they believed to be strategic for China in order to have bargaining power to try to get China to speed up its exports of rare earths.
Well, so when you talk about the walkbacks we've seen from this administration on various fronts when it comes to China, how much of a dovish turn would you characterize it as, Anna? And if it is indeed a dovish turn, how upset do you think China hawks in and around the administration and elsewhere are about these moves?
Well, look, I definitely think that China hawks are going to be upset, regardless of whether the rollbacks are of restrictions that were imposed recently by the Trump administration or of previously imposed restrictions, because from a China hawk perspective, none of this technology should be going to China at all. But I also think that in terms of trying to measure whether or not this is a dovish turn by the Trump administration, we still have to wait and see. Because at the end of the day, this will only be a truly substantive change in U.S. policy towards China when it comes to export controls and access to critical U.S. technologies if we see a rollback in Biden-era export controls. I certainly think that that is something that China wants. And it may be, it's possible China will get something like that. Because we know that rare earths exports the licensing approvals have picked up, and there's some evidence to indicate that shipments are beginning to flow more smoothly. But certainly there's no approval of anything to go to military end users, for example. Things could always be faster than they already are, and they're not as fast as they were prior to these restrictions on exports of Chinese rare earths and magnets being imposed. So we'll have to see whether or not the Trump administration is willing to give ground on any Biden-era policies.
Well, do you worry more about the next DeepSeek emerging, or do you go back to your role at the Department of Defense and worry about what China might do with this technology when it comes to building weapons?
I think that whether or not China gets this technology from the U.S., I think that this buys China time to continue developing indigenous technologies without losing the ability to apply these technologies in various ways that are important for them in the near term. But China has been throwing enormous amounts of money towards indigenous development of its own technologies so that it won't have to rely on the United States anymore. It's been doing that for a number of years now, and it's been doubling and tripling down on that. I think it's only a matter of time before China doesn't need U.S. technologies in order to accomplish the various ends that it's trying to accomplish. And so that's happening regardless.
Well, speaking of matters of time, Anna, we just heard from the Treasury Secretary moments ago suggesting that August 12th should not be viewed by market participants as a deadline they should be worried about. Does that suggest to you that there is a lack of forward progress in reaching more of a trade agreement between the U.S. and China? Should we consider any of these deadlines to be real at this point?
Super fair question. It does suggest to me that they have yet to make it past serious discussion, make it to serious discussion of things beyond rare earths. I feel like rare earths has been the hair on fire crisis for the Trump administration, particularly because of the heavy rare earth magnets that are so important not only to electric vehicles, but also to traditional combustion engine vehicles and to so many electronics. And I think that, that will continue to be something that China can use as leverage to get the U.S. to the table. And until that is satisfactorily resolved in the U.S., mind, it will be hard to move forward on negotiation of other issues. I think it is worth noting that a couple of key heavy rare earths that are used in these magnets that have been in short supply, like dysprosium, for example, and neodymium, those also are not, they're primarily sourced from Myanmar. And the state in Myanmar that they're primarily sourced from has been incredibly unstable due to domestic conflict for the past six to 8 months. And China itself is having a hard time getting these things. So it's just worth keeping in mind that China is not necessarily simply using these rare earth export licensing restrictions to gain leverage vis-a-vis the U.S. It is also thinking about its own supply security, and that may limit how much it can negotiate.
Do you want to see President Trump, President Xi in the same room? Do you want to see a summit? And is that, in fact, where the president might be most likely to give up the ghost on this and lower export controls, to your point, from the Biden administration?
From the perspective of somebody who would like to see a more functional and healthy U.S.-China relationship, that sounds like a really nice thing. When I'm thinking about it in terms of strict U.S. interests, there are things that could certainly be gained there. If I put on my China hawk hat and look at it through the lens of security concerns, these are really difficult trade-offs. And a meeting that caused President Trump to relax export controls, bigger, more fundamental export controls on advanced technologies to China might not be in the U.S. interest.
Anna, we learned from President Trump yesterday that if no ceasefire agreement is reached between Russia and Ukraine within 50 days, that he will look to impose 100% what he described as secondary tariffs on countries that help Russia, including big buyers of Russian oil. Read China. How do you expect Beijing would respond if indeed something like that were implemented? Would their behavior be, okay, we're going to stop buying cheap Russian crude and exports, or we're going to potentially retaliate against the U.S. with tariffs in kind?
China certainly can't stop buying Russian crude or gas. And that's because it gets an even bigger percentage from Russia than it did before the Ukraine war started. And it's pretty heavily reliant on Russia. Russia's one of its main suppliers. So that's not in the cards. What is potentially in the cards is use of smaller companies instead of their main oil and gas companies, which is already to a large extent the case, to move that oil and gas and therefore sort of shield China's broader economy from any secondary sanctions that are imposed. If the secondary sanctions don't hit the big banks that are, if the big banks aren't processing these transactions, then, China can kind of prevent calamity from ensuing as a result of the sanctions. And we've seen them do that with their purchases from Iran as well. That's what I would expect that to be their first move.
Well, so Anna, if I read you correctly, if China's not going to be able to actually adjust its purchases of Russian oil, would that mean that these secondary sanctions, tariffs, whatever you want to call them, would not have the intended effect the president wants here, which is to put the squeeze on the Russian economy and stop them from being able to fund their war machine?
I don't think that they would have the intended effect, because I think that, other countries that are buying from Russia might not have the same safeguards in place to protect them from secondary sanctions, but China certainly has safeguards in place, and China is the biggest buyer. So, I think that we've been learning the hard way for a few years now that there are limits to the power of U.S. sanctions, and they don't always achieve what we hope that they will achieve. And I don't think that secondary sanctions on all sales of Russian oil are necessarily going to achieve what Trump wants.